Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Zeal or No Zeal. Today, up on the chopping block is Hollow Knight. This is a Metroidvania title where I explore different parts of a rundown underground town while taking out enemies and bosses along the way. The premise is simple, but I was excited to dive in nonetheless. Did the game resonate with me? Find out in this episode of Zeal or No Zeal. When I first booted up Hollow Knight, I was interested to see how my character felt to move around with. I immediately noticed that my knight was quite slow. I didn't have a dash move, and while I did not traverse long distances immediately, my main character was much slower to move around with than what I had become accustomed to in other titles. This was not a bad thing. I always felt in control of my character and had no issues getting from point A to point B. However, my first impression of Hollow Knight was that it would be slow and precise. This was the case for a little bit, but Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania, and as with many Metroidvanias, I progressed through the world, unlocked new abilities, and upgraded my character. These different improvements were fun, and while many games in the genre do the same thing, I still appreciated how they were implemented in Hollow Knight. I specifically appreciated the abilities. Not only did they give me more capabilities, such as a dash move and wall jumps, but they encouraged me to learn how these mechanics work both in combat and in navigation. Interpreting these moves was never a huge challenge, but it was still fun to get accustomed to. At the same time, I also unlocked new paths through the world, which saved me a lot of travel time. There were multiple fast travel systems and even unlockable gates to make traversal much more accessible. While it was still sometimes frustrating to navigate from place to place, overall I appreciated how the developers included ways for me to travel faster. Despite these great fast travel systems, Hollow Knight still feels incredibly slow. I think this was because I constantly got lost. And I think I got lost a lot because the world map was not very clear. There are a bunch of different miniature areas in Hollow Knight that comprise an entire game world. These are each labeled with both a distinct name and theme, and with a unique map that connects together with the other worlds. It's a super cool premise, and it helped make the world digestible. However, I still continually got lost. Though the map indicates many of the locations I visited, there was no guiding force leading me to the correct destination. There were a couple of vague hints like indicators for crucial opponents, but since Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania, I often had things to do in a specific order, and the map didn't help me interpret that whatsoever. This frustrated me a lot, as I constantly went in circles around the map looking for the place to go, just hoping to find some way to progress. Despite feeling frustrated with this lack of direction, I was further disappointed because I didn't know what I had to do and when I should do it. Specifically, this is present with the boss fights. There are a bunch of optional fights, but the game never really specified whether they were optional or not. I was confused by these, as I did not think I deviated from the regular path during my playthrough, yet I was constantly introduced to bosses that didn't help me progress. This was frustrating, as some would be significantly more challenging. In fact, once I was stuck on a boss fight for a while, gave up, and then realized I didn't even need to complete it at all. It took up an excessive amount of my time, and I was severely underprepared. It was far more difficult than anything I'd faced up until that point. It was a frustrating experience, and I wish I had known that it was optional, as I would not have tried at it for so long. The worst part of this is that these boss fights by themselves are super fun. Each boss fight I fought telegraphed its attacks nicely, engaged me in a different way, and constantly motivated me to take them out. However, I was introduced to bosses of varying difficulty all throughout the game. I never really knew what to expect going in, and this meant that I was often disappointed when I beat many fights on my first try, yet struggled on others for a while. Despite some frustration with the pacing and introduction of new challenging bosses, the boss designs were still great, and I thoroughly appreciated them. On the other hand, the regular enemies were much less exciting. None of them really tested my skills. They followed simple patterns, and honestly, while they were interesting to take out at first, they never really put up much of a challenge. This was largely because of the soul mechanic. This is a system in the game that took the energy of my opponents and allowed me to harvest it either as an offensive threat or as a healing item. This made basically every non-boss enemy meaningless. Apart from a few rooms where hordes of enemies attacked me simultaneously, I nearly always had ample time to take out enemies, heal, and then go into the next fight at full health. It made the world exploration monotonous. Combined with the general lack of direction I had in the world, I constantly felt like I was wasting time trying to get to different objectives. This made exploring the game world not that engaging. I was constantly lost, the enemies were simple, and while the world design was visually pretty, the levels were nothing to write home about either. The worst part of this is that it took up the bulk of the gameplay. Sure, sometimes I was glued to my seat for a while trying to take out a tricky boss fight. However, just as often I was meandering myself around the world taking out simple enemies. The primary gameplay loop is not bad. I mean, the enemies are fun to take out for a bit, but it's just not great either. Plus, it's frustrating to spend so much time on the part of the game that's significantly less rewarding than the boss fights. Overall, I'm very glad that I played Hollow Knight. When the game shines, it shines brightly, and there are a lot of great design elements that went into it. The character, while overall slow, is fun to move around with, and there are plenty of excellent boss fights to blast through. However, my experience with Hollow Knight was constantly diluted because I consistently got lost and could not set expectations for upcoming fights. I think this game has a lot of good elements, but I do not have zeal for Hollow Knight. Thank you so much for watching.